That's here. So I change it here. This is capturing CDs, which is how do you update both versions, but not just CDs? So this is the issue. And I, you know, we're not. That's why we yeah, I think we would be fine. Anyway, that's why I got more.
Welcome everyone. Can someone please close the door? This is so the Nmrg session, first Nmrg session of the week. We'll send the blue sheets. Okay, so this is the first session of Nmrg this week, 1 hour session. The key topic of this session will be on intent-based networking. So we will have a couple of presentations of new work proposed in this activity of the research group. We will have also a second session on Thursday where we will address other topics of the research group and especially a discussion on our ongoing like rechartering or evolution of the Nmrg scope and activities. So starting with the Notewell. So this is IETF research group, but the IETF follows the IETF policy. So this is the usual Notewell. Please read it and express anything with respect to that if you have something to tell. The usual request for starting the meeting. Can we have 1 or 2 minute takers, please, and also someone to relay questions and comments on Miteco and JavaScript. So thanks. Daniel for minute taker. Do we have someone to relay on Miteco? As usual, if we don't have someone, we will not start the meeting. So don't be shy. It's not a lot of work, especially for Miteco. It's just to relay where we are in the presentation. Okay, thank you there. Blue sheets. So please circulate the blue sheets, sign them. It's very important to evaluate the participation in the session and also to plan for future meetings. Last time we had, I think, several persons didn't sign the blue sheet, so it's very important to have this. And please circulate them across the room during the session. Thank you. Just a heads up for this week, as I already told you. So it's 20 years of Nmrg this year, and I think in March it's the kind of official creation of Nmrg 20 years ago. We will have a short discussion on the session 2 about a kind of retrospective of this period, and again to reflect on what will be the future of Nmrg. So now we have this session on intent-based networking, which is to follow up on various IBN activity we have been working on since a bit more than a year, and also with the goal to update the work plan based on new inputs. The second session will be on Thursday afternoon, and there we will have a set of inputs to the discussion about the future of Nmrg. Today's agenda, we have, so this is a short introduction. We have then a presentation from Richard on intent classification, supported by one of the drafts of submitted to the research group. And then we will have Jeff with IBM, the technology, a second presentation. And I would like to keep some time at the end of this session to have a discussion with the group, especially towards updating the work plan. So we already have some elements in the work plan, but I think new activities coming up also, and to define a bit more precisely what could be the deliverables on this activity for the research group, maybe identifying some milestones, objectives we would like to reach, and criteria for research group adoption. So we will switch to the first presentation, which will be done remotely by Richard. So Richard, if you can go online now, please, I will show your slide. Richard, we see you speaking, but we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now? Great.
Yeah, it's okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's quite loud, so speak normally. It's okay.
Okay. So thanks, everyone, and welcome to this presentation and discussion on the intent classification draft. Ultimately, our goal is to discuss and present a way and a means of classifying intents amongst users, amongst purpose, amongst layers. Currently, there's no common model, or actually, sorry, thanks. Currently, there's no common model or API or even definition for intents agreed amongst SDOs. But there are, and even actors, actually, even the actors involved in creating intents and designing intents are not always agreed. So there are several shared principles that we can start from. The first one, obviously, intents should be declarative, focusing on the what and not on the how. As far as possible, they should be separated from the deployment details. If we want to make the intents easier for the user, then we should use the language and terminology that the user is familiar with and try and avoid the technical terms and concepts. On the other hand, we want it to be technology independent. We also want it to be vendor independent so that it can be completely portable across all platforms. And finally, the intent framework. So even though we want to express the intent in a non-technical language, we would like that the framework should be able to detect and resolve conflicts between those intents. So the goal of this document is to discuss how we can classify intents in regards to some of these criteria. So on the next slide, we just talk about the context about this a little. Where does this draft sit in the wider context of Nmrg, IETF, and the other SDOs? So, of course, it's closely related to the work of Alexander Clem's draft on the concept of intent, and to a lesser extent to the work of the ANIMA group on autonomic networking. Our aims are probably broadly similar to those groups to influence the evolution of intent-driven networking, to bring clarity to it and encourage wider discussion and adoption. So in our case, we feel that we can bring something by defining a classification for the intents. How does this relate to the Nmrg charter? So the charter includes communication services between management systems belonging to different management domains. Intents need to be technology independent and easily transferable. And if we can provide a robust system of classification It'll make it easier to transfer those intents, as well as easier to catalog, search, and retrieve, which will make it easier to achieve reuse of the intents. Secondly, Nmrg is expected to identify and document requirements, survey possible approaches, provide specifications. So this current draft, okay, we said achieves the first level. It's probably a little premature to say it achieves the first level, but it's a starting point for discussion about the identifying and documenting the requirements, surveying possible approaches. The next step for the near future work would be to provide the specifications for the proposed solutions. So some more formal definitions of the categories and addressing some issues like prioritization, where intents overlap or where there are multiple classifications. Okay, so the next slide for requirements for different users. So I've mentioned that for different stakeholders, there are often different ideas about what intent means. That often happens when new terms come out. People assume that the term means something because of their particular experience and domain. So what we'd like to do is establish a lexicon for intent to identify what each stakeholder wants from the intent. But beyond that, even who are even the stakeholders for intents? What different needs do they have? What interfaces, what DSLs, what models do they need? All the different solutions and different users will have different use cases, requirements, will have different levels of technical expertise. So by answering all of these questions, we hope that we can identify the best way to classify these intents. So some of the ways that we've looked at, starting on the next slide, would be based on solutions, users, and purpose. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So what are the best ways we could look at the intents? One way would be by solution type, obviously, enterprise, data center, carrier, maybe by 5G specifically. Another way would be by the user of the intent. So administrator intents might be designed to keep the system running smoothly and efficiently. In an enterprise environment, administrators might also create intents that could be reused by multiple users. In a larger carrier organization, that might be the role of a separate operator. And beyond that, there are layers between, for instance, carrier customers like OTT providers and enterprise providers, and then their customers as the end users. Similarly, there would be distinctions between end users as customers and end users as application developers who would be providing applications to those end users. Then a third way we could look at classifying the intents would be based on purpose. So customer network service, network resource management intents, cloud and cloud resource management intents, network policy, system policy, task-based. Okay, so we can, so then intents can be used to operate, so classification based on when to activate. Intents can be classified based on when the intent should be triggered. That could be immediately, if there's an immediate urgent need, or maybe when some event happens in the future, if an intrusion is detected at a specific time in the future, let's say during a maintenance window, periodically at a specific time, so maybe every weekend you want to have an intent, or when some condition occurs. So maybe you would monitor the MOS score of your video link, and if the quality degrades, then switch it to a more reliable transport. The next classification maybe could be based on lifecycle management requirements. So basically, either transient if the intent has no life cycle to manage, or persistent if there is a life cycle to manage. So a persistent intent would be a more typical intent with monitoring, closed loop, self-optimization, whereas a transient intent might be just a fire and forget, one time only. So what the implications for that, I guess, a transient intent maybe shouldn't be considered as part of intent conflict resolution if it was just a one-time intent. They have no life cycle. If they should be considered as part of conflict resolution, then that probably implies that they should be a persistent intent. On the other hand, although a transient intent has no life cycle itself, it could be that the transient intent would have an impact on persistent intents. So, for instance, if you had a transient intent where you wanted to migrate all services from one host to another, it might need to update a set of persistent intents which were designed to support the services on that host. So update those to the new host. Okay. So intent classification based on granularity. Again, intents can have, this is a simple classification, intents can have different granularities. High granularity intents would specify the intent at a higher level, closer to the business need, further from the details of the technology. This would make it maybe more difficult for the framework to reason with the intents for translation, for verification, and conflict resolution. But they would be more powerful intents if they could remove all of that overhead and work from the user. So they're more powerful intents. On the other hand, then you could have low granularity intents, which would operate closer to the technology, maybe further from the business intent, which would be breaking down the intent into smaller pieces, either horizontally, if you're maybe dividing it among technologies, separating it by domains, or vertically, if you're specifying more and more detail incrementally as you move through the layers, like the example on the slide, for instance, where you have, at the high granularity, you'd have service quality for video transmission to user A. At a lower granularity, you might have intents supporting that, ensuring packet loss rates are no higher than a certain percentage. Okay, and then finally, just that in all of the work on intents, we should also build on the body of knowledge around policy. So, for instance, we should look at the possibility of classifying intents in the context of the policy continuum. Policy continuum describes actors at different levels of abstraction and mapping of policies between layers. So this is obviously analogous to our concept of different intent users and different intent layers. So, and having different lower layer intents supporting higher layer intents. So a device intent might support a network intent supporting the service intent supporting business intents. Okay, and then finally the next steps. So we see that the intent has a very wide and slightly vague scope at the moment. So Alexander's, and we need to tighten up maybe the terminology. And Alexander Clem's draft is working towards this. So we think that adding classifications could help to break down that work, to separate it and provide different areas to investigate. So we need to engage the community into that discussion about what intent means to different stakeholders and how intents could be formally classified. Also, we should investigate whether or not common intent DSL or model or APIs are required. And if we believe that they are, then we should propose initial drafts for those. We should also consider if maybe natural language is, if not the immediate approach for intent, then maybe it should be at least a target. And also, where would the user intent language, the life cycle, the multi-tenancy, and conflict resolution, where would all these fit in the future network architecture? Whether they would be part of the intent or part of the framework or outside of them both. Okay, so I've mentioned a few times about the Alexander Clem's draft. Obviously, that's a key draft that we need to work with. We also should stay close to the work of the Anima group on autonomic networking, and to see where the autonomic nodes, how we should distribute the intents among autonomic nodes. So which ones would need to be distributed in their original form, and if there are intents that can't be distributed along the lines of Anima, whether they would have to be, whether there's any issues about having to break up those intents before they're distributed. So finally, some findings from this work could feed into the requirement for future design of the intent framework. For instance, the ability to detect and resolve conflicts between multiple intents. Okay, so that's all I have. If there are questions or...
Thanks, Richard. We now have a few minutes for comments or questions on this presentation.
Hi, good morning.
Turn it up.
Is it on? Is it on? Yes. Okay. Great. Daniel King, thank you, Richard, for the presentation. So is the objective here to have one intent framework and potential language to rule them all? Because there already are a number of intent, declarative and some imperative work that's out there, things like group-based policy, group policy, general purpose information model, event condition action, role-based access control. So it seems that before we even think about a framework, it's worth having some kind of comparative analysis of what already exists, where it's used, what are the use cases, because there's intent that's used, as you mentioned, for sort of data center orchestration of resources, some networking, sort of application integration into things like IT orchestrators as well.
Yes, that's all true. I think the intent here, the aim here is not to propose a single language to rule them all. I think, as you mentioned, there are different bodies of knowledge already that we should reuse at different layers. So when in our world, when we think of intent, we still think more at the top level of the business intent, and that needs to be broken down into intents at lower layers. I think at the lower layers, maybe at the device and at the network and even at the service layer, there will be more mappings to existing works in the policy arena that you've mentioned. I think at the business layer, there are probably fewer. And I think maybe, again, there is some work there. Again, I'll reference Alexander's draft. So we're not proposing to provide a new intent language for this, although we need to work with the intent language as it's defined, and we would like to input to it. But this is more that by classifying it, we may be able to say there are different languages, different intents at different layers, at different vertical levels, at different horizontal levels, depending on the user and the solution that's required.
Will from Huawei. So actually, I'm here to also answer Daniel's question. So Actually, this draft is a very good base for us to start intent-related work in this RG, because as you already see in this presentation that in the world industry, there are already many kinds of categories of intent. So just, before we have a clear scope and a clear consensus on the understanding of what is the intent in the terms of in the perspective of IETF and RTF area scope, and then we can start to really work on what it will be the use case architecture and even the data models. However, before all of this work started, we first need to know, we need to know that in the whole intent continuum, which part will IETF or RTF will work on, and I think that's what we want to answer this question. From based on this presentation and also the draft. That's the answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question, comments. Thank you, Richard, for the presentation. Okay, I just put a note for myself also in the Etherpad about the relationship with the other draft from Alex Clem. We tried also to define some intent definitions. I think for this work, it's an interesting basis and input that the group can build upon. But I think we still have to go through some iteration to clarify the priorities, maybe as Will was mentioning, also the scope and what could be reused, or what will be a bit the directions for this work, and especially I think in a few months, how to consolidate maybe with other works and become more like a research group document or set of documents. Okay, thanks, Richard. We'll switch to the next presentation from Jeff.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So I'll be talking for the next 20 minutes or so. The intention here is to kind of show you the process taking place, how to design intent system, what it takes, some considerations, and really some feedback from deployments, and all the open questions. Next slide. So why are we here? Nmrg is home for IBM, so it's natural to be here. There's a lot of stuff that still needs to be researched before it can go into IETF streams to be standardized, to be implemented eventually. So problem space, southbound part of it is pretty advanced. Thanks to all the young work, Benoit is here. We've got pretty good set of interfaces to configure stuff and to get telemetry. If we look at telemetry, as of today, most of it is already model-driven. I could extract pretty much any piece of information I need on demand, so it's really great. And I don't really need to poll system anymore. I can subscribe to a particular set of events. When I know what I need, I'll get what I need. The intent consumption interface, the northbound part of intent system, is not really defined. We know there have been a number of frameworks, people trying to do this, but as industry, there's really nothing. One more point, I specifically avoided the policy part. It's a somewhat poisonous topic. Practically, we did quite some research in the industry, and it looks like group-based policy is the most developed part as of today. It's implemented a number of platforms, including OpenStack, including OpenDaylight. Most vendors have plugins into this framework, so it looks like most mature framework to use, from my personal perspective again.
Dejan Bogdanovic, you said northbound is not well defined, and will you be talking in this presentation why we cannot use some of the southbound frameworks that we already have today, or?
No, it's not why, it's really not defined, and if you look at young models...
No, I understand, but will you be saying why we cannot use some of the southbound models, why they don't fit that bill, or...
You mean using southbound models northbound?
Yes.
I don't think any work we've done in Young today is good enough or high level enough to provide intent consumption, from my perspective at least.
I agree to disagree.
I know what you are doing, right? So,
so that's fine.
but you needed a hammer to make it work, and I don't want hammers. Next slide, please. So if you look at today's landscape in industry, basic automation is there. It's pretty much solved problem. You could go into something that's closely related to vendor's hardware, things like ACI and such. You could go all the way up into automation tools such as Napalm, Salt Stack, and this kind of stuff, and just configure stuff. Single sort of truth is being worked on. There's some work on it. We know there's, again, some tooling in the industry to provide at least configuration management, versioning. So it could be used as single source of truth. It's a mandatory prerequisite, however, it's not really a problem. The real problem is real-time change validation. How do you deal with the changes? How do you do it at scale? How do you decide what they really mean? Because your network is not just a set of nodes. It's whole vertical stack of services, one on top of another, and figuring out what change in particular layer means to other layers, it's quite complicated. So this is the focus of this presentation. And obviously prerequisite for self-operating network, which is the end goal of IBM. So philosophy, very simple. We define outcome and we go towards it. So intent-based network is not about how, it's about what. What does it do you want? Next slide. So problems to be solved. Composition, decomposition, and scale. You need both functions. You need to compose in order to build vertical scale of services. And again, as a networking routing space specifically where I belong, looking at number of models you need to build and still missing the service level abstraction is a problem. So composition is needed in order to create a service. On another side, in order to troubleshoot, in order to understand change in particular level and correlate it to other levels, you need to be able to decompose your complete service into different parts. How do you deal with changes? If I want a change that I plan, how do I decide what can be done without affecting SLAs, SLOs, what cannot be done, to what degree? So the understanding the impact before change taking place. Unplanned changes, networks break. I need to be able to understand at any given point the deviation between operational state and intended state and take actions to get back to intended state. Next slide, please. So closed loop validation is the key here. I need to be able to constantly validate operational state of my network, and anytime there's deviation from what I intended to be, I need to be able, if not fix the problem, at least notify operator, look, there's a problem, do something about it. The idea of getting all the information isn't doable. We see already today in mid-sized network, amount of data generated is in terabytes. So getting all this data, analyzing it is expensive and it's pretty much undoable. So we need to figure out how to get less data, but much better data, higher definition data, data that could be used and actionable. Next slide, please. So this is the picture of mid-sized network with all relationships. So scale is significant and it's multi-layer, pretty much in any network. Even if you take the simplest network, we still have layer 0, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 to deal with, as well as service on top. So why do we need composition? As I said, in order to understand impact on vertical slice, so service plus network plus all this layers on top, we need to compose complete picture. Next slide, please. So why model as a graph? And this is kind of going to lead us into all other discussions because our idea of modeling network is really a graph with all the relationship, set of attributes attached to this relationship, ability to easily extend model when needed, ability to query graph at any given point in time to get data, to be able to query my network particular question. So I'm not going to ask you, tell me everything. I'm going to ask my network, tell me how your interfaces towards particular layer look like. Next slide, please. Yeah, it was supposed to. Anyway. So for this discussion, I've taken a very simple network. It's a data center fat tree, very regular, very repetitive topology, so it's easy to reason about, and we are going to use it. So if you look at the graph model of it, we've got spines that has interfaces on it, has links on it that's connected to leaves, that has interfaces on it, that connected to servers. And so we are going to use this picture. Keep it in your mind. Next slide, please.
Animation on this one?
Benoit speaking, just to help Laurent whilst he's doing the admin, right? I'm trying to kill the time. So you mentioned everything in there. This is great. There is one thing that I don't see. This is like the KPIs per service, right? Because in the end, I mean, the service being just configured is not enough, but we need to understand whether a service is degraded for a definition of a service, which is also an intent definition.
Absolutely.
Will you be covering that?
Yeah, so if you look at service definition, and this is again kind of missing part because it's definition of your service, how do you express your intent? So it's not only EVPN with particular connectivity points, it's also amount of bandwidth, delay, any set of KPIs and SLAs you can imagine, we should be able to express an intent-based system to deliver the services.
Exactly, and not only at the service level on top of an orchestrator or controller, but also for some of the technologies. How do you know if this specific technology works fine, right? It's part of your tree which is in there.
It is.
So yeah, that's the next thing the IETF should be doing, looking more into the assuring specific technologies, right? To make sure at the top it's assured as well. And this is the way to go to intent.
We are in full agreement. So composition, this is the graph representation of what we just described, just simple leaf and spine network in data center. So how do we compose a service, again, full slice, and not just pieces of network? We take spines, we take leaves, now we know how they connected to each other, we take servers, and we also model links between them. With one more slide. So as you could see, the last one was virtual network validation. So virtual network has nothing to do with physical topology. It's really your service topology. So it could be your L3 VPN, it could be your VXLAN network, could be your EVPN, could be something that is required as a service. By having relationship with physical topology, now I've got full graph that gives me ability to model the service. I have full context. I know what to ask for networks. I know if particular node in my graph fails, I know what's going to be affected in what way. When I bring analytics on top, even simple things such as counters on the switches or bandwidth between two links, I know exactly what it means for the service. If I go into planned operations, I want to upgrade my switches. I know exactly how many switches at any given time I'm allowed to bring down in order to upgrade, because I understand service definition, service SLOs, and what it's going to take to deliver them. Next slide, please. So decomposition, as we said, we need to be able to decompose in order to extract analytics from particular part of the network. What's decomposition? Really take big problem and kind of chunky. So taking the graph, I'm going to walk you through. So this is the full graph of leaf and spine network with services. And now we're going to completely back. Next slide. So empty tree, we start with spines. Now we want to see all the links from spine in any direction. Next slide. Now we've got the connected interface on another side. Next slide. We've got our leaves. Now I want to see how they're connected to servers. So what we just did, we built full graph of the network. If you look at any modern graph database, it gives the ability to attach any metadata to the relationship itself. So I could name a particular node, I could name its relationship to any other object in the graph, I could attach any semantics or metadata to it. So if I want to see every node that is related to spine in this case, I can easily query. If I want to see any link that goes from spine in particular direction, I can do so. I can attach vendor name. I can ask, I want to see all the switches that are Cisco. I want to see all the systems that are EPCs. So the graph, the rich graph that's built here gives me ability to inquiry it for any given information. So for this particular case, I'm interested in any path from one part of the network to another part of the network. So if we walk. So as you could see, there are obviously 2 switches on one side and 4 switches on another side, which gives us 8 paths in total. Now, just using simple routine for each link in linked list, I could walk every link. I could measure performance of the link. I can understand what it means to the service. So if we keep walk 8 times. So you see, I'm just going path to path to path between leaves and spines of this network. I can easily accumulate load on all the links. I can easily understand what it means if one of the links goes away. I can easily understand if there's some performance degradation, what it means to the service. So full correlation between state of the network to state of the service, to an ability to provide this view to tenant, so to owner of the service, as well as remediate. And the last part of the presentation is really about analytics and how do we deal with analytics in complex systems. So if you gather all the data, you know what you're going to end up on. Huge data lakes, no one understands what's in them, what do you do with them, you just keep them and delete them every 2 weeks. So definitely doesn't work. So in order to get good answers, we need high definition telemetry. We need to know a lot of stuff. However, the amount of data, if you gather everything, is really unanalyzable. So this is an example. I'm getting telemetry. Then I ask for all the telemetry on single leaf. And then I ask for all the telemetry on my leaf. As you could see, amount of data is just growing exponentially, and it just interfaces, just counters. So if you try to ask everything related, you'll pretty much
I have issue with how the word telemetry is being used. And I think we should agree upon what we mean by telemetry. Do we mean by what is the scope of the measurement? Or is it the data that is being transferred? Having a good definition for telemetry would be helpful. Because right now that term is a little bit overloaded.
Daniel King. So on that, there's a document in the Ops area working group right now that's sort of a telemetry framework that attempts to provide a definition for telemetry, and it's really difficult actually because I tried to look at other SDOs and some open source projects and things, like the Linux Foundation with Panda and things, and finding a clear definition of telemetry was not possible. They're all subjective, depending on the different deployments and use cases.
Agree. So I'm very much familiar with the document, it's contributed to it, and on one side, there's a lot of stuff around. On the other side, we are lucky that we are finally getting telemetry that we needed to. We have the ability to get high definition telemetry. We can get telemetry directly from the ASIC, so we're not limited anymore by the local CPU on the host. So all the stuff is coming, and it's finally model driven. So in general, there's enough means to get good telemetry. However, my point here, we cannot afford to gather all telemetry available. Storing terabits of data a day is not financially viable, and you simply cannot analyze it. Most of telemetry is only relevant to the moment it has been gathered. So really what should be done, you get the telemetry, you analyze it, you know the context, you throw it away.
You have 3 minutes left.
So an example, based on this slide, can I tell you whether my fabric is CMP balanced? Obviously not. So an example how we can do it. Since I know the part of the network I'm trying to measure, my query to the graph would be, show me counters on all spine interfaces connected to leaf, which, as we know, there are 8, right? I get the data. I implement number of operations, so I could measure standard deviator. I could watermark it and say, get this information for number of minutes, so I could see the behavior of my network in number of time. Next slide, please. In this case, I'm interested in behavior of my network in 3 minutes out of 7. So if my parameters are met, I can decide my fabric has been degraded. I could go remediate. There's a number of ways to do so. Or I can just let no operator, look, my fabric is not working, do something about it. So the summary of what I've just shown is that the analytics have to be context aware. You really need to know right question to ask in order to be able to answer it. So the continuous validation requires continuous sync of queries with intent and context of it.
Daniel King, sorry. So there's also some ITU work that started a couple of years back on network innocence and guilt. Is that different from this? I mean, so if you've identified that there's a single or multiple metrics that potentially are causing an anomaly with your service, how do you prove which is the contributing factor, or is it a combination? That's the kind of discussion that the ITU were having. I can't remember the study group. And that's very hard considering.
It is. So in your question, we are going really to root cause analysis, right? So if one of the link goes down, you'll probably receive 10,000 events from BGP session goes down to all kinds of changes in routing, to routes disappearing, to many different things.
But that's assuming that it's a network level issue. Maybe it's just too many users attaching to the network.
Yeah, it was just an example.
Sagittarius is aligned with Capricorn. It seems that there's potentially, in a big data set, there's a correlation with something completely outside the scope of the network. Is that something that would be in this context?
Absolutely. So the easy answer would be machine learning magic, right? The real answer is, at least what I've been trying to design is to build pipeline of events when I can define symptoms. And if I can match all the symptoms to particular events, I could identify the root cause analysis. It's not an easy work. It's difficult technically. It's difficult because it's a continuous process and network changes as we do this. So you really need to decide in advance the slice of time you're going to take in order to identify root cause. And I think this is very interesting work that really belongs here as well. It's kind of it's more research work than standardization. And figuring out how to do it properly, I believe this would be the right place to do so. So to conclude, automation is a very hot topic. Everybody's talking about automation, but practically automation of configuration is done deal. It's not so complicated anymore. The problem, however, 1 second after you have deployed your configuration, your network becomes day 2 network because someone is changing something in configuration, there is change in connectivity. So there's drift of intent, if you wish. It's not what you intended it to be, it is what it is. You need to be able to gather the operational state, all the derived state, compare it to your intended state, and be able to explain the differences, whether you need to remediate, whether you need to do something, or it's still good enough to meet the SLAs. So, and I believe this area requires a lot of research. So outside of definition of APIs and normal standard works, we need to look into how do we do data operations. It's most complicated area in this topic in general. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, before we go for the question, because we already have several during the presentation, just a situation point on the blue sheets. Please make them circulate because I see that there have been new participants in the room. So raise your hand and try to sign the blue sheets. Thanks. We try to have, okay, I see a lot of people lining up. Let's try to be very efficient with the comments, try to capture them also in the minutes, because I really would like that we have at least 2 minutes to show what will be the next step for the work plan. But we are finishing in 9 minutes. So please be to the point for the comments and the answer.
Okay, only 2 simple questions. So for the first one, I searched the internet draft in IETF, and since now there is no clear definition of IBN, so I wonder, I mean, what kind of a scope would you want for IBN to map to, I mean, Nmrg work? This is the first question. And second question, actually, I really like this presentation. So there is a slide. You are mentioning the levels of IBN, or it's like automation or something like that. So I wonder whether that's accurate because I only saw this level 0 and the level 2 to level 3. So I don't think that's makes sense to me. I'm sorry. So that's 2 questions.
So I think unless you can build full lifecycle management, this work is meaningless. You cannot do just part of it. So we're talking about design, deploy, operations continuously. So this should be the scope. You should know how to express your intent that it becomes a blueprint. Mm-hmm. So network you intend to design. Then how you deploy it. So what you have designed should be deployable, or if not, you should know why. Mm-hmm. And then the continuous operation, so ability to take telemetry from the network and correlate it to the state of your network. So I believe this would be the scope.
I mean, so you mean all these sentences you mentioned, those is the whole architecture and the related processes, the concept of your intent to map in Nmrg. So I have a second question. I mean, I have an additional question for this one because I don't think most of them are. I mean, only part of them can be mapping to. I mean, IETF work, and other part maybe some internal software realization, and that is not a. I think. Okay.
Sure, we don't disagree, but I think what's important, and one of the goals as mentioned, is to be vendor independent and able to work with anyone else, is to have set of well-defined APIs to allow to communicate with any other system. So this is the only way you are communicating to external world.
Following on directly from that point, because I think we're trying to discuss the same thing. Are you proposing, I really like what you've put together here. I think it's a really good exploration of the problems, particularly with the large-scale data management, the amount of, and I'll use the word telemetry in quotes here, the sheer amount of input data you're having to use to make your decisions to match your intent. Great explanation, that's fine. Where does the IETF and the IRTF fit into this? What are we trying to define? Where are the interoperability points, and what are we missing that the southbound doesn't provide us, or that we need to define in a vendor-neutral manner at the northbound side? I mean, do we need a policy description framework, a way of defining a policy that can be shared between different vendor installations and different customer installations? These are questions. Describing how one might solve constraint-based logic programming problems through machine learning or expert systems or whatever, I believe that's totally out of scope. That's great academic research, and we've been doing this for 50 years now, and we will continue to do it. And there's a great rabbit hole, but this is not the forum to go down there. I'd love to see what people believe are the gaps that IETF should look at and what is fully out of scope.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we can talk about this.
But I would like to remind that we are in the IETF research group. So I think it's fully valuable and valid to think what could be transferred or what would be scope of work for IETF, but I think it's not the primary motivation of this work in Nmrg. Maybe, again, the discussion is welcome.
Yeah.
But I don't want everything to be discussed from an IETF point of view.
Absolutely. And I do take your point. I just think if we make the boundary of the problem so big, we're never going to make any progress. And I'd like to I would suggest that this working group a research group scopes itself to where it can actually make some progress rather than saying, hey, let's look at constraint logic programming for a bit.
And this is the point of the update of the work plan. But thank you.
Benoit, just following on this, because actually you said most of the thing I wanted to say. I'm working on this in my company, and I'm scratching my head on what are we missing here. We're missing a couple of building blocks, right? A couple of those, a couple of tools, but all the rest will become very quickly proprietary. So yeah, I understand the goal to be multi-vendor, but it will be, there is not much we could do in the IETF to solve that issue, I believe.
So I believe all the young work done contributes to be vendor independent. This was the intention when we started working on Young, right?
Sure. For me, Yang kind of done in the right path. Maybe not in production yet, but it's there. Config done. Operational data done. What are we missing? The feedback loop, the KPIs, the context that you mentioned, and all this. But how much could be done? How much should be done here, as opposed to something proprietary? Because this is where the intelligence will be.
Okay, this discussion is very interesting. We have to cut the line after Martin. Okay.
So, please go. I'll answer it afterwards.
Okay, I'm Charles Eckel, but this is from the Jabber Room. Pedro asked a question there. He says, what about events potentially hidden by the aggregation operation?
So if you don't get the data, you cannot act on it, simple as it is. Right? Someone needs to, or device who does aggregation needs to understand the context. It's as simple as it is. You don't see things, you don't react on them. So
so those would be hidden and they just, yeah, okay.
So
I'm just going to wait for a second.
From another angle, however, if you know the context, you could go and ask for this particular thing that maybe had been aggregated before. So.
Yeah, I think we can have follow-up, more deep discussion about even the ability of extracting more knowledge with less data. I think it's an interesting scope and research aspect. I would like to insist on that. One comment more as a contributor, I think in your proposal, I think it will be really interesting to go into some kind of providing measurements, some maybe aspect of evaluation, because I think you are making a proposal here, some statements. Maybe we also, as a research group, and maybe collaborate with Nmrg or some other group that, do we have any kind of, data to support that we should go into that direction or measure the gain or the gap, you see? So to get a bit of numerical evaluation or results in order to support this statement in one direction or another. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Jeff, for the presentation.
Thank you. I'm available for questions. So.
Okay, 1 minute left. Try to switch to the work plan, but I think most of that will be discussed anyway offline or at the next meeting. We will have a virtual meeting in April to follow up. Let me just switch to the other presentation. Okay. Yeah, so very quickly, the current work plan that was discussed and agreed in IETF 100 in Singapore was to work on three lines, how to call stuff. So essentially to produce documents on aspect of terminology and taxonomy. Second element on how to express or model intent. So more elements towards information modeling, grammar or languages aspects. And a final line around how to realize intent-based systems. So more towards sketching a reference, functional architecture or functional blocks, components, use of mechanism and techniques, theory of operation and life cycle of such a system. So this is what we discussed a bit more than a year ago. We also mentioned that additional items could be proposed, like specific work on function and techniques, use cases, other challenging areas. So I think we have seen today, for instance, work that complements some of the lines, but also propose new things. Based also on some previous discussion before this meeting in the Nmrg, so there will be a need to update the work plan for various reasons. So extend, update it with maybe more concrete aspects and also capturing some of the comments of today to clarify what type of problems we are trying to solve with this concept of intent-based networking. I mean, is to describe it at the research group level, scope the discussion also, and provide maybe design challenges and goals to guide our work. Complete also, extend the work on terminology and taxonomy with some aspect pertaining more to define the concept, explain the concept in the first stage to clarify intent-based networking and intents. Also mentioned as part of the presentation from Jeff, the aspect of should we consider intent at various times, I mean, design and run times, and more use of continuous integration, continuous delivery as part of the operation. I think Jeff mentioned the importance of day two operation. So how intent what would be the role and place of intents in that scenario, and if or not the research group has something to say in that aspect. So interoperability, I think some of the comments were on the aspect of what could be work in the scope of IETF with respect to this IBM technology. Some elements of interoperability, we may need to identify them. It may not be the mission of the research group to work on that, but maybe to de-risk or to identify some of the challenges or areas, and then maybe identify potential work in the IETF. So this could be an area of investigation for the research group. As part of the presentation of Jeff, also the aspect of be able to continuously validate the realization of the intent, and also the cost of this validation. If we need to measure large amount of data, is it a right and sustainable way, or if we need to have a more sophisticated approach to try to put context into how to extract meaningful knowledge out of data. One element I think is very important for the research group is to grow in the area of try to evaluate, validate this concept of intent-based networking to provide a bit more numerical or results to sustain or to support various approaches. We may even go towards proposal for aspect of implementation or demonstration of some of the functionality. This is something we can think about for this activity in the research group. Okay, we will not have the time to really discuss about deliverables and milestones. I think this will be in the agenda for the next virtual meeting. But I think we need to define clearly objectives for this work in the research group with some milestones that we would like to stick to. And also thinking about, because currently this is more individual contribution we have in the research group, the work is structuring, but at some point we will have also to assess when do we really embark it as research group activity, and the goal, the end result we would like to reach with this work in the research group. Just in terms of support that we will provide for this activity, so we have a lot of discussion since Singapore, but also in Montreal, I think we are a bit struggling to make more regular progress. So the incentive will be to have more regular dedicated virtual meetings for this activity. It will be up to the various contributors to define a bit the period of these meetings, but we will provide support for that. Maybe use also a couple of interim meetings to make a bit of face-to-face brainstorming, editing session, whatever clarification work on the architecture that needs to be, that is more easily done face-to-face with some whiteboards. Tentatively, we are trying to organize something in June. The target here will be second or third week of June, potentially in Silicon Valley, Mountain View, Santa Clara, something like this. And details will be discussed and communicated. Next target will be also July. We can have kind of interim side meeting during the IETF week, as we did last year, and we are also preparing something for October as an interim meeting in Europe, maybe in Bologna with some of the contributors from University of Bologna, to have there maybe a target of more like hands-on or practical approach to intent-based networking with maybe a kind of a warm-up on potential validation aspect, evaluation aspect with some simulated environments or lab environments for IBN, and maybe targeting later on some like hackathon participation in the IETF scope. Then also support, use the mailing list. I think we have very good comments here based on the interactions. Please try to port them to the mailing list, because some of the people are remote, some of the people cannot come to the IETF meeting, but they are still interested into this topic. So, I mean, we will pause the minutes, but if you have specific points of discussion, use the mailing list to the best possible. And if you think we need other tools to support this activity, create maybe a GitHub repository, other collaborative platform, whatever you need, just come to me. We will discuss it and provide the support required to make this progress. Because I think we really need now, we have a good set of participants and active contributors. As I said, the work is structuring, but we need to start delivering and progressing along the year on this topic. So thanks a lot. Sorry for the extra time, especially for the remote participant, but thank you very much for being here, and we see you on Thursday for more discussion. Thanks. And don't forget the blue sheets, please.